sticking up for you just now.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to House of Women Operations.
Wonder if it works.
9:15-ish, 9:10-ish, 3:15, March 15th. We're going over amended draft of H270 with Ledge Council. That's our miscellaneous cannabis bill. And I realize, Michelle, thank you for waiting. I know you're on a tight clock, so I won't waste any time.
Thanks. So I'm going to just go right into the draft.
Thank you.
Andrea, can you let me share my screen?
No, I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay, can everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go over the language that's new from the bill as introduced, and I've highlighted the language for you, and that should be on the committee webpage as well. So the first section, sorry if it's a little disconcerting for all the scrolling here, but we're going to go down to, and there's a number of kind of just technical amendments that I've made because you've added a new type of license for the propagation cultivator. So there's a lot of places in here that are highlighted that I'm just trying to make it, jive with the addition of the new license. So you'll see the definition of cannabis establishment now includes propagation cultivator. You now have a definition that applies to all the chapters with respect to the cannabis establishment regulation for cannabis propagation cultivator, and that means a person licensed by the board to cultivate cannabis clones, immature plants, and mature plants in accordance with the provisions of the chapter. Then moving on to section 4 on rulemaking, there's a few things there. The first is just a technical. And then moving down to a change to subdivision 5 with regard to rules concerning retailers. And I think the board can speak to this. They asked for this change in response to some comments from Department of Health. And they wanted this small change on lines 20 and 21 around the requirement that rules that the board adopts with regard to retailers having to do with facility inspection requirements and procedures, that it just be that those inspections have to occur at least annually. Then now at the top of page 6, you have new provisions for rulemaking for those new propagator licensees. So you see they need to have requirements for proper verification of age of customers. They have to have rules around pesticides or classes of pesticides that can be used by those propagators. There has to be standards for indoor cultivation of cannabis, procedures and standards for testing cannabis. There have to be labeling requirements and regulation of visits to the establishment, and then facility inspection requirements and procedures. And these are specific just to the propagators, but there is, just so you know, a very long list of rules that are required with regard to all of the cannabis establishments. So if you don't see it here, if you look back up into the existing law with regard to subdivision 1, it lists all the things that there have to be rules for all the different types of licensees.
No, thank you. You actually just answered a question, my first question.
Okay. So section 5. This is new, and this is addressing the issue of records requests and what's public and what isn't. And so this is repealing the existing statute or provision with regard to records, and what is adopted in its place is in section 6, which is its own new section. So you'll see subsection A is stating the purpose of the section, which is to protect the reputation, security practices, and trade secrets of licensees from undue public disclosure while securing the public's right to know of government licensing actions relevant to the public health and safety and welfare. Subsection B is just clarifying that all meetings of the board are subject to the open meeting law. Subsection C starts to identify the records that are exempt from public inspection. Subdivision C1, this is what is already in current law, which is records related to the licensee security, safety, transportation, or trade secrets, including information that's provided according to their operating plan. And then the second one is records relating to investigations, except for subsection D. And so we'll take a look at that. So subsection D relates to complaints or investigations of licensees. So you'll see with the lead-in language, if a complaint or investigation results in a formal action to either suspend or revoke, condition, reprimand, warn, fine, or otherwise penalize a licensee based on noncompliance, the case record, as defined by 3 VSA 809E, is to be public. And I'm just going to, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm just going to show you what the case record is. Let's see.
Thank you.
So you see, looking at Title III, you'll see subsection E there. So the case record includes the list that you see there. I don't necessarily need to read them out to you, but I can, if you want me to, I can send the link to Andrea if you want to have that for the record.
Yeah, please send the link. It would be a useful context.
Sure. So subdivision 2 is that the board is to prepare an aggregated list of all closed investigations into misconduct or noncompliance from whatever source. And the information contained in the list is to be a public record. The list has to contain the date, nature, and outcome of each of the complaints, but it isn't to contain the identity of the licensee unless a formal action resulted as a pursuant to the investigation. And then subsection E, you'll be very familiar with, which is just our standard language that we add in there to make it clear that it continues in effect and isn't repealed through operation of the provision for public records law.
Okay.
So moving on to page 9, section 7. This is just some clarifying language to make sure it's clear that cultivators, when they're going about their business, that they can purchase and sell seeds and immature plants, not only to other licensed cultivators, but also to a propagation cultivator. On line 13, that's just a technical that I added. Similarly, on subdivision A3, we want to clarify that the propagation cultivator licensee, when they're required to test, transport, or sell cannabis seeds that meet the federal definition of hemp, that they can do that to a licensed cultivator or a retailer or to the public. Next one we'll start is section 12, and this is on the fee schedule. So there is a change that was requested from the board for manufacturers, for tier 1 manufacturers, that fee be changed from $10,000 to $50,000 per year in cannabis products. So they have a fee of $750. And this is just changing the threshold for that $750 for having to pay that $750.
Understood.
Pardon?
No, thank you. I was just saying thank you. Yep, sorry.
Sure. And then there's a new fee that's added for the propagation cultivators. And so that would be $500 annually. Ten is just a technical. And I think that might be it, but I just need to run. Oh, there's one more here. And and I hope this is okay with y'all, I added this one, and you had already bumped out the date for the auditor's account a year, because you'll see the language that struck on line 10, it was supposed to be due this November, and it's bumping it out to 2024. And so rather than just keep the November 15th date, I changed it to the 1st, just to make sure that based on once you receive the report, that you have plenty of time to be able to kind of take in that report, talk about it, think about it, and in order to meet your drafting deadline. So if you want to do some type of drafting related to whatever the auditor comes back with, that you'd have plenty of time to be able to meet the introduction deadlines.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay. Does anybody in the room have any questions for Michelle right now? Rep. Morgan.
Yes, thank you. What again was the big bump from 10 to 50,000 again? I forgot what we asked for that to Michelle.
That's the threshold for when somebody is paying the fee. Let me pull that language back up. Sorry.
I think it was paid.
It's basically raising like a sales threshold.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of being able to sell 10, they can go to 50.
Right.
Per dealer. Or,
so if you're a manufacturer producing products without using solvent-based extraction, not more than 50, right now it's 10,000 per year, then it's a fee of $750. And I think this is something that was requested by the board. So I believe when Pepper testifies, he can talk to you about their reasonings behind that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anyone else? No, thank you for the time. I'm sorry we started a little late, and I know you're pressed, so.
No worries.
The chair just arrived, so I don't know if he has anything to add to the conversation at the moment.
Thanks for your work on this, Michelle. Really appreciate that. I know that I've heard that the Human Services Committee, they did, we're calling this a drive-through, right? We're trying to get rid of drive-by. They did a drive-through of this bill yesterday. The chair indicated she'd send me written feedback for us today based on their conversation. But I think, and I gave Michelle a heads up about this, that they may have a couple tweaks that we'll look at this afternoon probably. So trying to keep this train moving, but incorporate the feedback that we've got from our colleagues upstairs. So we may see Michelle again later this afternoon.
And I'll join you a little later this morning once I'm done with my other obligations.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Thank you so much,
All right.
Michelle.
Thanks.
All right. So we believe have an updated order here. Okay, so Bryn, are you ready to take the hot seat? Thank you. Really appreciate you being here today. I apologize for me being late, committee. We obviously have kind of a tough drive in, especially from as far away as St. Albans. So it's about a 60% longer drive than I'm used to. All right, Bryn, thanks for being here. Take it away.
Thank you for having me. So for the record, Bryn Hare, Executive Director of the Vermont Cannabis Control Board, here to talk about draft 1.2 of H270, the miscellaneous cannabis bill. I thought it might make the most sense just to go through the changes, the highlighted yellow portions that Michelle just went through, unless you want me to start over. And
no, I think that's great. If you can take us through and give us the board's perspective on and rationale for those changes, that'd be great.
Sure thing. So the initial changes that are found in section 3, just the addition of the propagation cultivator language. This is the request of the board to add this additional license type of a cannabis propagation cultivator, and that assures that the board is able to give licenses to folks who just want to grow some canopy to grow young seedlings, and that will ensure that the regulated market has a source of safe and tested baby plants, and so we no longer have to rely on the illicit market for seedlings. So that is the rationale for the cannabis propagation cultivation license. Happy to talk more about that if you'd like. The change that's on the bottom of page 5, this is in section 4, the rulemaking section. We heard some feedback from Attorney Englander from the Department of Health that we need a statutory requirement that these cannabis retail establishments will be inspected annually if we want to eliminate the sort of overlapping jurisdiction between the Cannabis Control Board and the Department of Liquor and Lottery for inspecting retail establishments that sell paraphernalia. So this is addressed in the sort of as introduced version of the bill, but we got some feedback that we don't have anything in statute that requires that we inspect our retail establishments annually, although we do. So this would just add language that would actually require the board to inspect these retail establishments annually, and that will satisfy the requirement for the Department of Health. Is that clear enough? Okay, I'll move on to page 6. And this is the language about the rules concerning the propagation license type. So for every license type, the legislation sets forth a series of sort of criteria that the board needs to develop rules around. The criteria that are set forth here on page 6 about propagators are very similar to the requirements in rule or the requirements in statute for rulemaking around cultivation licenses. So similar pesticides, what pesticides are going to be used, how are we going to require that the license type check identification to verify age, standards for indoor cultivation, what are the testing standards and the labeling requirements, and how are visits to the establishments going to be monitored? Are you allowed to bring visitors? And then facility inspection requirements. So it's quite a similar set of requirements for us to develop rulemaking around as what we had to do for cultivation licenses.
Are there any particular, are you envisioning any particular rulemaking or differences in the sort of inspection regime for the propagation cultivation license versus the cultivator license? It seems like it's a pretty similar, the language is kind of
Yes.
kind of a cut and paste for the most part, but are there any like differences we should be aware of?
I think that this is essentially a cut and paste from the rulemaking requirements for cultivation licenses. I think that the board's sort of vision of this is that we will try to make these rules as like we're going to make them as unonerous as possible for people to be able to get in to do propagation licenses while still maintaining the integrity of like the testing requirements and labeling and age verification and things like that. But to the extent that these people are growing plants that are not going to go into flower, so there may be less value associated with the young plants as opposed to the more mature plants, the security requirements and things like that will probably be less onerous than the full cultivation license type. So I think there are, and I should have done like a comparison. I think there are some directives to the board to make security requirements by rule for the cultivation license types. And maybe that's not here. That may be one difference between the two. Okay, I'll move on to section 5. As Michelle noted, this language that's struck on page 7 is the existing language about what records are exempt from public inspection under the Public Records Act. And most of this language is just dropped down into the following section. So there's a new section that governs what records are confidential. And subsection A there, starting on line 15, is new. So the legislature tends to do some explanatory language about why it is exempting records from the public records from inspection. So that's the language that's found there to protect reputation, security practices, trade secrets of licensees from undue public disclosure, while balancing the right of the public to know what is going on that's relevant to public health, safety, and welfare. So
Nugent has a question. Sorry.
Just curious, is that customary for are there other industries that is done for, or is that?
Yes, yeah, so this, my understanding is that what is laid out in this section is pretty similar to what exists for the Agency of Agriculture for their kind of inspections and investigations with respect to the people that they regulate. So I think we are seeing quite a bit of similarity between the two.
Thanks.
It might be a good question when Attorney Childs comes back
Okay.
later, if you want to circle back to that and just to ask her if this is kind of standard language for other similarly regulated industries.
So top of page 8 sets out the records that are exempt from public inspection. And as Michelle noted, that records related to licensee security, safety, transportation, or trade secrets, including information provided in an operating plan, is existing language. And then what we've added here is records related to investigations, except as provided in the next subsection. And the request that this is sort of a request from the board, because as we begin to do our investigations of complaints, we are trying to balance what makes sense to keep confidential, what information makes sense for us to keep confidential, and what is important for disclosure to the public. And this language, I think, really does try to walk that balancing line to be sure that we can withhold information that would compromise our investigations, compromise the security and safety of our licensees, but also be as transparent as possible about what is happening that would impact public health or safety. And, you know, I think a good example of this is the investigation that we recently did with respect to the Holland cannabis contamination. The board, as soon as we received the complaint and had verification of that complaint, we issued a public consumer safety notice that warned the public about the contamination event. And then as we did the investigation, we are keeping the results of the test results confidential until the investigation is complete, and then all of that will be made public. Okay, if there are no other questions about that, I'll move on to page 9. And I think, again, these are technical amendments here to just include language about the propagation cultivation license. So propagation cultivator license, I think there's a change there at the bottom of page 9 that would allow propagation cultivators to test, transport, sell cannabis to a licensed cultivator or retailer or to the public. And I think the next change is page 12. Yeah, there was a question about this, about the manufacturing tier 1. We have those 3 tiers of manufacturers. Tier 1 is only allowed to process and manufacture using non-solvent based extraction methods. And it was originally designed to be a very accessible license type, which is why it's only $750. And the board capped the amount of income that license type could bring in at $10,000. And we received quite a bit of public feedback from folks that were interested in this license type that $10,000 was not sufficient, and that $50,000 would be a more representative cap on where they would wind up with this type of license. So we are responding to that and raising the cap to $50,000. Manufacturing tier 2 can do the same types of extractions, just doesn't have the total income cap. So next change on the same page sets the annual licensing fee for propagation cultivators at $500. And this is, again, designed to be an accessible license type. We really are proposing that fee in comparison with some of our other fees that we have recommended. So the tier 1 outdoor cultivation license type costs $750. So this would be, a step down from that. So it would be the least expensive license type. Next change, I think, is a technical amendment. I do have one additional request, a little tweak that the board is requesting on page 16. I can follow up with Michelle about this. This page 16, this is the caregivers section, and it's relevant to the new language that would remove the fingerprint supported background check requirement and instead require the check of the Child Protection Registry and the Vulnerable Adult Registry. there was, if you look at page 16, section C, starting on line 5, there's existing language that requires the board to adopt rules and set out standards for determining whether a caregiver should be denied a place on the caregiver registry if, because of their criminal history record or the applicant's status on either registry. And his or her criminal history record was struck there. And it was pointed out to us that it makes sense that the board should be able to make these determinations about whether a caregiver should get a card also based on their criminal history record and not just their status on the registry. Otherwise, why would we be requiring a criminal history record check at all? So just.
I just want to know what to ask legislative council. So your recommendation is that we just, after the applicants include criminal history record and or status on that?
Actually, even simpler, it's just to unstrike his or her criminal history record.
Yeah, the problem is we're removing we do
His or her, yes.
gender language, so
Okay.
I just want to make sure it reads right. So we're gonna keep criminal history and remove the gender language on, that's line 5 of 16.
That's right. It's line 7.
7, yeah.
Yes, and I'm
Seven into 8.
I'm happy to follow.
Oh, yeah, the clause starts on line 5, so it's paragraph C. No.
I think we're all saying the same thing.
Yeah, just want to make sure we don't, so let's remove that strike. Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. Representative Hooper, sorry. Making my notes here.
Mr. Vice Chair, now I remember what my issue was. Are we looking inside or outside borders for that history?
It's I believe that the language just sets out our Vermont criminal history record check.
That kind of was my problem. Somebody that popped across the border to start to do this, we have no history on them. Is that an issue?
So I'm just verifying, connect to Vermont criminal history record check, right? So I think that's a consideration for the committee, whether a person who is crossing the state lines to commit a crime and then coming back, if that's a genuine concern of the committee, I would just reiterate what I think we mentioned the first time we were here, is that really the vast majority of these caregivers are family members that are providing care to a sick child or a sick spouse. So I think that there doesn't appear to be a real industry like for caregivers. It really seems to be like either close friends or family that are providing the service.
Sure, in its youth, I suppose, but as bugs creep in everywhere.
Yep.
And, under this language, somebody could get out of jail in the morning in Albany and come over to apply for a Bennington caregiver situation and probably pass the background check in Vermont.
Well, I think that what the board has really been focused on in our criminal history record checks are the types of crimes that would indicate that the person was a threat to the safety of the person that they are supposed to care for. For example, the criminal history record checks that we do in the adult use licensing, the board set out rules that indicated that if a person had committed the types of crimes that indicated that they were probably participating in the illicit cannabis market, that wouldn't necessarily preclude them from joining the regulated market. So I imagine with respect to the rules around caregivers, we would be similarly positioned to really try and look carefully at what would actually impact, what types of crimes would actually indicate that the person would not be an appropriate caregiver. And whether or not, if the committee feels strongly that we should be doing a full 50-state background check on these folks, then we could leave the FBI fingerprint-supported background check there. I think we were really just trying to reduce the administrative burden on these folks that are really primarily parents and friends of people who are pretty sick in the state.
Can I just ask, because I think what the word caregiver implies a lot of kind of power and responsibility. And I think it might help if you could just remind us, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, what is the power that a caregiver has in this context? Like, what are they actually allowed to do on behalf of the person who's on the registry?
Grow plants for them. If many of our patients, are too sick to engage in the cultivation of cannabis, so they're allowed to grow plants for them. They're also allowed to go to the dispensary and pick up medication for the patient. And it's a pretty limited set of things they're allowed.
Yeah, I would.
Also administer.
Phrase the question, maybe what's the potential of what they can do? Once you get into a situation where you're trusting and dependent upon somebody that has a tendency to grow outside the boundaries of maybe this particular relationship into other ones. I would be more comfortable if we recognized that somebody that came into the state with less than a year's worth of history here went through a different procedure, not necessarily somebody who's been a family member or involved in an intimate circle with the individual. But when you start dealing with people who, have no history, it's pretty hard to assess what their history has been.
So you're saying like a residency threshold?
Yeah. Haven't been here a year.
Or just like a different screening process depending on how long you've
Yeah.
been a state resident? Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was processing what you're saying.
Early abuses. Tom's thing.
Well, how many people who are requiring care elderly, I guess is a question I would have if that's your focus. Like what percentage of the patient population utilizing a caregiver are elderly? I don't know if that's any data that the board has.
We can,
I hate to sound like a pessimist or something, but one person is too many because we didn't do something to prevent it at this stage.
Yeah, so I guess what is kind of zooming back. So designation as a caregiver allows that adult to sort of ride on and facilitate the patient's medical privileges of being on a medical registry. There's nothing that would stop an adult now that we have the adult use retail market from going and purchasing cannabis and giving that to somebody else if their desire was to do something criminal, right? So what we're saying here is that we're lowering the threshold a bit for those folks who have a caregiver relationship and just making it easier for people to facilitate the purchase or the grow for folks who are on the medical registry. And so I still am trying to get at, I think there is the desire, it is reasonable to have a certain level of background check, but I'm also wondering like sort of what we're trying to prevent. I think if there's a specific suggestion, given the amount of testimony we want to take today and the lateness that we're at, that we either that this is a real deal breaker and we need to keep the more stringent 50 state background check, or that we have a bifurcated system. I mean, I guess, Brent, if that's a path to alleviate Representative Hooper's concern for us to say, for folks who have lived in Vermont for more than a year, this is sufficient. But for those who have a recent residency in Vermont, we'd like them to go to the full check. If that's something that would sort of square the circle.
yeah, we could, I'm thinking about how we would administer that. We could certainly ask if we were, depending on how the legislature wanted this language to look, we may have to do some sort of investigation ourselves as to whether or not the person has lived in Vermont for the last year or has lived in other places. Because if we just asked them, I'm not sure that would be sufficient.
My concern is we're through this instrument, we're creating a state sanctioned sort of thing. And we should make sure state sanction is protected as much as possible. And I recognize that it's outside the realm of the actual relationship that we're sanctioning, possibly.
Try to figure out a way to expeditiously address your concern. My brain is moving on
No,
fast.
Yeah, I'm down like.
Representative Music, go ahead.
I guess for me, it would be helpful to have some clarity around the access that these caregivers have to the people they're taking care of. Like, is it like a delivery driver, or are they in their homes, like with access to, their whole life thing? Or is it a variety, I guess?
I think that it does represent a variety of relationships. We don't specify in rule like what the nature of that relationship has to be. I think that for some people, they go and pick up their medicine and they bring it back and they help administer it in their home. And for other people, it may be more of a delivery type service, somebody who is no longer able to drive, for example. So I do think it represents a variety of different like factual situations.
So we have some more testimony from caregivers and folks who are involved in cannabis patient care coming right up. So let's keep thinking about this a little bit, and we can come back to it later this morning in that testimony and committee discussion. Okay, that makes sense.
So that is the last thing that I have, except for the change of date for the auditor report, which I think you already decided on. So I don't think that's a real change.
Great. Well, Bryn, thank you for being with us. And I hope you'll stick around and hear what other folks have to say in case we need the board's response to some of the further testimony and committee discussion.
Yes, I will stay until Patrick can arrive.
All right. Thank you. All right. So we have a number of folks who are going to be giving us some testimony this morning. I've invited people who've requested to testify and have many different perspectives. Some are representing patients, caregivers who are involved in therapeutic use of cannabis. There's a couple of folks who will be testifying that are representing cultivators of different types. And I've asked folks to try to keep their testimony time, within the bounds of 10 or 15 minutes if possible, because of our tight timeline, and also to stay focused on the topics that we're considering in H270. I know there are a lot of different cannabis policies being discussed in the public elsewhere in the building. It's crossover week. I've committed to continue to have room for and be open to more expansive policy conversations after crossover, especially in the context of bills that may or may not come over from the Senate. But for now, I'm trying to stay focused on H270. So I just wanted to frame up some of our further testimony that way. So I'll be trying to put a little bit of gentle bumpers on some of the conversation if we kind of veer way off topic. But I want to invite Amelia Grace from the Green Mountain Patients Alliance. Amelia, are you there on Zoom?
I am.
Great. Well, thanks for being with us today and being willing to testify. And so, yeah, please share your perspective with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just pull up my prepared testimony. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope you made it into work safely. Thank you, Chair McCarthy, for inviting me to speak today. My name is Amelia Maishi, and I'm a patient, an advocate, and the co-founder of Green Mountain Patients Alliance. I'm here today to speak specifically to the medical policies addressed in Bill H270 as they pertain to the patient experience. I'd like to start with a little bit of background on myself. In 1999, at the age of 4, I was diagnosed with an incurable condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This is a connective tissue disorder that causes thin skin that bruises and tears easily, joints that are loose and spontaneously dislocate, as well as comorbidities that affect my organs, immune, and nervous systems. On top of that, I have Crohn's disease, and I deal with, the mental effects of a lifetime of medical-related trauma. The first point I'd like to touch on is the proposed language to expand the qualifying conditions to receive a medical card. As it's currently written, patients who are diagnosed with one of the approved conditions or with a disease or medical condition or its treatment that is chronic, debilitating, and produces the symptoms of cachexia or wasting syndrome, chronic pain, severe nausea, or seizures qualifies for a medical card. I would propose that rather than continue with a list of conditions that patients will have to appeal to have updated with their own, we move to a symptom-based qualification system. Vermont already recognizes 4 symptoms as qualifiers, but replacing the existing conditions with the symptoms we recognize cannabis is used to relieve will expand registry access to thousands of currently unregistered patients. For example, cannabis has been known to relieve anxiety, depression, and panic attacks in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, but those 3 symptoms are not qualifiers on their own, even though the state recognizes the value of that relief in PTSD. My suggestion is that Vermont look into why certain conditions qualify for medical cards and how each of those conditions shares symptoms with numerous other diseases that could be relieved with cannabis. Moving to a symptom-based model would not only increase access to the registry, but it would also give healthcare providers clearer guidelines to verify that their patients are finding tangible relief through cannabis. When I was approved for my card at the age of 19 in 2014, it was under the symptom of chronic pain because Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, something that is both incredibly painful and degenerative, is not on the conditions list. In H270, you seek to add ulcerative colitis and IBS to the conditions list, which I absolutely believe deserve to qualify for a card. However, Crohn's already qualifies for a card and shares a majority of symptoms with both UC and IBS. Under a symptom-based model, all chronic GI disorders would qualify without needing to go through the process of individually approving every single one. Also in H270, you seek to exclude chronic pain from the annual renewal exemption. I would just remind you that many conditions not listed as qualifying, including mine, have chronic pain as a symptom, and excluding those folks punishes them for needing to settle on the closest qualifier possible, meaning they might have an incurable or long-term condition, but because their condition is not listed, they then have to fall back on chronic pain. So that excluding them doesn't really make sense there. Moving on to the proposed plant count increase, I firmly believe that we need to do away with numerical immature plant caps and replace that with a canopy allowance of 250 square feet for immature plants. Capping the number of immature plants someone can have also places a limit on the number of mothers, clones, and seedlings someone can have at once. This means that folks will have less genetic diversity in their own grow and will take a lot longer to find cultivar and terpene combinations that do the best job of relieving their symptoms. In short, limiting genetic diversity also limits symptom relief potential. 6 mature plants is also not enough for many patients who make their own concentrates and edibles with the flower those plants produce. I would recommend increasing this number to 12 mature plants and a square footage canopy allowance for immature plants rather than a set number. Regarding the caregiver amendments, I agree that caregivers should be able to serve multiple patients, but patients also need to have multiple caregivers. There are many examples where this would apply, and Green Mountain Patients Alliance is currently recommending a system where caregivers may care for 3 patients, patients may have 3 caregivers, and both can circumstantially apply for more on a case-by-case basis with approval from the CCB. Patients who are minors will automatically need multiple registered caregivers to relieve parents of the burden of a single family member being the only one in the house who can administer cannabis 24/7. Increasing the amount of caregivers that a patient can have also protects that patient in the instance that one of their caregivers experiences crop failure, especially in the outdoor season in Vermont. And that would ensure that the patient still has medicine should that occur. I'd also like to touch on Representative Hooper's concerns about the background check. There really isn't any incentive in Vermont to become a caregiver. There is no money involved. Nobody's getting paid for this. It is largely done out of charity so that patients can afford their medicine. And while I understand the concern that somebody could come in from out of state and get a caregiver card fairly quickly, from that point on, there really is no benefit to that person. it doesn't really make sense to think that somebody could be trying to take advantage of a system where there's no benefit to them monetarily. Medical cannabis reform should be patient-centered. Throughout the history of Vermont's medical program, the state has failed to take into account patients' lived experiences. I've been navigating the healthcare system, advocating for myself, and educating doctors about my condition for 23 years, longer than a lot of healthcare professionals have even been practicing. My firsthand experience and the experiences of thousands of Vermont patients should hold just as much weight as the opinions of doctors and their lobbyists. I'm no longer a registered patient on the Vermont Medical Cannabis Registry. The program did not evolve in a way that supported my needs, but that does not stop me from being a patient and finding relief through cannabis. There are thousands, and I have to stress, thousands of unregistered patients in our state who either do not qualify for the program or do not see value in what it offers. And we can make real tangible changes to this program that will make life better for the most vulnerable people in our community. But in order to do that, those changes need to vastly increase access to the registry, and once registered, needs to address the individual needs of each patient via caregivers who can provide the one-on-one care that a dispensary simply can't. So in summary, I'm asking you to do 3 things today. 1, adopt a symptom-based qualification model for obtaining a medical card rather than condition-based. 2, increase the patient and caregiver plant count to 12 mature plants with a square footage canopy allowance of 250 square feet for immature plants. And 3, allow caregivers to care for 3 patients, for patients to have 3 caregivers, and allow both to circumstantially apply for more on a case-by-case basis with approval from the CCB. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Amelia, thank you very much for your testimony. So I wanted to, my first question, and then I'll go to the committee, is that what I heard from some of our colleagues outside of the room yesterday who have looked at the conditions versus symptoms is that there was a sense that the falling back on the broader symptom-based language that's in what's, in current statute, paragraph C, a disease or medical condition or its treatment that is chronic, debilitating, et cetera, that symptom-based catch-all in that paragraph sort of alleviated the need to continue to list out more conditions. And I'm wondering if you could, I don't have that perspective, but I heard that perspective from a couple of other members outside of the room yesterday. So I'm wondering if you feel like, and it sounds like you do, that we still don't have a broad enough symptom-based set of qualifications, even though we do sort of approach that in existing statute.
Absolutely. There are many symptoms that are unique to certain conditions, but there are also symptoms that aren't listed that share amongst a bunch of the conditions that are listed. For example, insomnia, anxiety, depression, like I said before, panic attacks. And with respect to ulcerative colitis and IBS and Crohn's, there are gastrointestinal symptoms that all of those share, that are also shared with dozens of other diseases. And so, I don't think I need to explain to you all that over the last 10 years, we've only added 2 conditions to the list. And both times it's because a patient has had to take the initiative to come in and appeal for their condition to be added. And if we keep doing this like this, it's going to take us years to actually have an amount of conditions that covers even the majority of patients in Vermont. Whereas if we switch to a symptom-based model, we can expand that access so much faster.
Any other questions for Amelia? Well, thank you so much for your testimony, Amelia. I appreciate you joining us today.
No problem.
Next, we're going to hear from Jessalyn Dolan. Jessalyn, are you there?
Yes, thank you so much. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Chair McCarthy for allowing me to speak and be here today. For the record, my name is Jessie Lynn Dolan, and I'm here on several fronts. I'm a registered nurse specializing in addiction, mental health, and chronic pain. I was formerly the nurse director at Lund Inpatient and Outpatient, as well as the school nurse at SOAR through Northwest Counseling Services. I'm the former director of the American Cannabis Nurses Association. I'm the current president of the American Nurses Association here in Vermont for all nurses, and I'm the founder of the Vermont Cannabis Nurses Association. With Amelia, I'm a co-founder of the Green Mountain Patients Alliance, which is part of the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition with the Racial Justice Alliance, Vermont Growers Association, Rural Vermont, and NOFA. We work collaboratively together on all our recommendations and requests. I'm a cannabis patient myself for chronic pain, having had over 3 dozen surgeries as a child, and I ironically have the same genetic connective disorder, Ehlers-Danlos, that Amelia mentioned, as well as being a sexual abuse survivor with PTSD. Without cannabis as medicine, I would be on disability and 6 or more addictive and debilitating pharmaceuticals. I am able to be a nurse and help other people because of cannabis as medicine. I've been a cannabis caregiver for another nurse in cancer remission for years. So I'm here to speak to you today about the many needs for patients and caregivers in our medical program and how together, hopefully, we can support these positive changes with Bill H-270. I did submit my testimony and I want to continue with that, but I do want to address one thing that we were speaking here today off the cuff. So speaking to the perception of that's being spoken to about caregivers, the representative speaking, I think, has some misunderstanding and misinformation and is a bit biased. I want you guys to remember that nobody becomes a caregiver to grow illegally and then sell to the black market. If they wanted to do that, they wouldn't sign paperwork with the state of Vermont allowing someone to come in and audit or search their property at any time. Please recognize that caregivers, myself as a caregiver, we care, and patients do and can benefit from caregivers. And the testimony I'm hearing today is a little disheartening and almost feels like it's being criminalized. So if we could leave some time to address this at the end of my testimony or the end of today, I would really appreciate that, because I am a bit saddened by the assumptions that are being made of the concerns around caregivers and would love to continue to address that more. But I do want to finish the rest of my prepared testimony I have for you. I wanted to start by applauding you for adding several new medical conditions to the current list of conditions that are allowing medical cards to be signed for. As a medical professional, I'm in support of changing from a disease-based qualification system to a symptom-based. I would ask you to please consider trusting medical professionals and allowing them to make the determination as to who is appropriate to recommend for medical cannabis, just like we do with providers who provide Suboxone to the correct people, rather than them only being able to if the patient's disease is already listed as allowable per legislation. So please consider changing to a symptom-based system. And again, I do thank you for the additions you've added. Thank you for also looking to remove the mandate for patients with PTSD to need 2 signatures. As a nurse and a patient with PTSD, I know all too well that traditional therapy is not the answer for everyone, that not everyone can even find a therapist right now, and not every therapist has education with cannabis. So that extra signature is just another barrier for treatment. I'll ask you to please work with the CCB so that patients with chronic diseases do not need to apply for their medical card annually. My genetic disorder, the same one Amelia has, is never going away, unfortunately, yet I have to reapply every year. And for the chronically ill, this is an undue burden. I'd like to speak to increasing the plant count limitations. So I'd like to share a quick personal story. Several years ago, I immediately needed a lumpectomy for a concerning breast lump and only had 2 days to prepare for surgery. I needed concentrated cannabis oil and after surgery for the pain. So to make enough of my own concentrated medicine to not need opioids after surgery, I needed about 1/2 pound of cannabis flower, which equates to 1, if not 2, entire indoor harvests and a minimum of 3 or 4 months of my growing time. So 2 plants is not enough cannabis for people who need higher doses of cannabis like surgery. I think it's important for you to understand the quantity of cannabis needed to treat certain conditions and make certain products such as concentrated oil, and how one surgery literally utilized 1/4 of my annual cannabis medicine. It was made even worse when, due to being rushed and nervous before surgery, I ended up burning my own medicine, even with the experience I have, wasting 1/2 pound of cannabis and didn't have more cannabis to replace it because of that 2 plant limit. Patients and caregivers need more than 2 plants when growing and making their own medicine for so many reasons. Outdoor grows, which are much more common, easier and more affordable, are only allotted 1 harvest a year. 1 harvest with 2 plants is not very supportive and helpful for patients, and more people grow outside as inside. If you only harvest a few ounces per plant a few times a year or once outdoors, 2 plants can be detrimental. If the plants aren't clean or healthy enough, people need to be able to destroy them knowing they have others, knowing they're allowed more than 2. We need to help make cannabis medicine affordable, and growing your own is one way to do so, but 2 plants isn't even close to enough. Having been a cultivating caregiver for another nurse for a long time, because she couldn't cultivate herself because her husband was in the military here in Vermont, I understand the trials and tribulations of growing. A cultivator needs some wiggle room to destroy a plant if it's not as healthy or clean as a patient needs. Growing isn't as easy as everyone thinks and has a big learning curve for many. There can be pests and disease that attack the plant. So rather than trying to save or salvage the plant material, which we see all too often, caregivers need to know they can destroy that crop and start over to ensure cleanliness and safety for the patient. If caregivers could have the assurance that patients have access through a higher plant count, and even better, another cultivating caregiver on the team, we could help ensure that level of comfort and, again, safety for the patient. So we need to increase the amount of caregivers per patient. We need caregivers to be allowed to support more than 1 patient as well. I'd ask you, why not? We need to put patients first before prohibition and before biases and stigmas. As a nurse, I want you to consider what having 1 or even only 2 caregivers means and how that is a setup for burnout. The burden placed on that 1 caregiver 24/7, 52 weeks a year, usually family is the one that has to be that caregiver and also pick up the work slack and the other responsibilities of their ill family member. This is actually inhumane. As baby boomers will need more care, we desperately need this to happen to avoid burnout and secondary trauma amongst family and caregivers. So please remember that that many people don't use cannabis or end up back on their pharmaceuticals and opioids because they can't afford cannabis. Cannabis is not affordable for patients, and cultivating caregivers can help bridge that gap. So please increase the plant count to 12 flowering, the caregiver count to 3, and patient count to 3. Please also join us in asking the CCB to work on a price management system for patients at the dispensary to make cannabis more affordable and accessible. So in summary for today, I ask you to please consider adopting a system-based qualification model of support and support the removal of the second sign-off needed for PTSD. I ask you to remove the necessity that patients with chronic diseases reapply annual, and increase the patient and caregiver plant count to 12 mature plants with unlimited vegetation, or the great idea Amelia just gave you with a 250 square foot cap. Allow caregivers to care for 3 patients, for patients to have 3 caregivers with CCB discretion for more. Lastly, and one I feel so passionately about, is to allow patients access to shop at adult use retail shops without paying extra taxation. Patients drive from Newport to Burlington and would rather shop and support local. There's no reason patients should not have access to adult use without paying exorbitant taxes. Many adult use retailers are shouldering the cost for patients by covering their taxes and shouldn't have to. Please allow patients to shop at adult use retail without exorbitant taxation. This could be an enormous support for our patients, and I'd ask you to discuss this with me and other patients more. So please include our testimony, healthcare providers, patients, caregivers. Yesterday, I believe medical was taken up without grassroots, patients, or caregiver voices. So please consider allowing us to speak and to listen to our words, as well as looking to have a medical professional on the medical program team with the CCB. Thank you for your time, and please feel free to ask me any questions, or if there is more time, I would love to address the concerns around caregivers even more so. Thank you so much.
Questions for Jesselyn? Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. Hi, I am wondering, I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but Amelia said that often a healthcare provider will, or she referenced something about how a healthcare provider will just use chronic pain as like a catch-all for, conditions that aren't mentioned in the law. And I was wondering if you have any idea or concept of how often this occurs, or if it's like a prevalent thing amongst healthcare providers to just kind of use that as a reason when they can't fit whatever the symptoms are into a different box that's not legally allowed.
Absolutely. I do feel that is what what is happening, what I've heard from both patients and caregivers, that if they do medicinally feel that cannabis is a safe and good option for them, that they have to find, the way to make it work. So check off the right checkbox, putting in the right diagnosis, instead of saying, yep, this would benefit the symptoms that you're having. And we know you're using cannabis already to support those symptoms. So I do think we see that. I think it's also great and important for you guys to know, unfortunately, the truth of reality is that cannabis education is not in nursing school. It's not in medical professional schools. And here in the state of Vermont, we don't have any mandated education regarding that. So we are also looking to help educate and have our healthcare professionals understand and work a little bit more as far as educating themselves to be more supportive for our patients here in the state too. So thank you. That's a great question. But yes, unfortunately, I think it is being lumped into chronic pain a little bit too much. And if we could expand that, I think we would see some positive feedback from providers and patients.
Jessalyn, the way that the bill is currently drafted, I wanted to sort of segue into a little bit of the conversation we were having and your testimony about caregivers, is that additional caregivers shall be at the discretion of the board. So, where it says a patient who is under 18 years of age can have 2 caregivers, I'm assuming that just covers patients who are minors can have at the discretion of the board more caregivers, but we've limited that for adults.
I would ask you not to limit that to pediatrics at all. When you think about a time frame of a 40-hour work week, you need multiple caregivers to be caring for that patient if they need round-the-clock care. Or as Bryn mentioned, sometimes it's somebody helping a patient administer their own medicine. So if we have one caregiver playing that role 24/7, as I mentioned, we are looking for burnout. We have a lot of people moving into that baby boomer and that elderly needing support phase of life. And if it's one caregiver and they're only available 40 hours a week, that patient isn't getting what they need. If we're expecting that caregiver to work 24/7, 7 days a week, again, we are setting them up for failure, which is then a detriment to the patient themselves to have a caregiver who is literally burning out. And as I've mentioned, as we age and get to this stage where we have a lot of baby boomers who want to use cannabis instead of opioids and other harsh chemicals, if we don't have a support system with caregivers readily available instead of burning out, we are not doing our job protecting and supporting our patients.
Other questions for Jessalyn? Representative Nugent.
Hi, I'm just curious if you can kind of give us a sense of like what that looks like on a day-to-day basis for a caregiver. Just thinking about like dosages and how long it would last, like what that looks like.
It's a great question. Thank you. So it really depends on the form of cannabis medicine they're using. When you think of using edibles, that is the medicine that lasts the longest in your system. So hopefully 4 to 8 hours, cannabis medicine can work for an edible to be effective. If it's a disease process such as spastic pain or, IBS, something that comes on quickly, usually most people would administer either vaping or smoking. To have that work consistently, that's often a product people would administer every 1 to 2, maybe even 3 hours as needed. If we have a patient that needs a caregiver because they can't physically do the work of getting that medicine ready for themselves, we are leaving patients every 2 to 3 hours to figure out how to administer their own medication rather than having someone available to help them. So essentially the way I look at this is, I've mentioned I've been a school nurse before. 40 hours a week, I'm there with that child. Who's taking care of that child, whether it's a child again or an elderly person, because we do know elderly folks need the support to use cannabis medicine instead of other pharmaceuticals if that is their option. We have 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week when you look at a nursing staff and shifting, right? That is what a caregiver is. It is essentially someone helping to support their person, their patient, their family with medical support. That should be 7 days a week, 3 people a day in shifts, unless we want to expect one caregiver to do all of that work. The same caregiver that likely also needs a job to be able to afford their patient to access to this medicine and for them to continue to have their other supports in place. So when we look at dosing, it really is unfortunately, but fortunately, because there are a lot of options based on which medication they're using. But even if they are using the most long-active cannabis medicine, they would need someone to administer that at least 4 times or more a day. And just asking one person to do that is asking someone to work full-time, round the clock, without a day off ever.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Jesselyn. I really appreciate you bringing the perspective of a medical professional who is working with cannabis, because that's an important one, I think, to have in this conversation. So very much appreciate your testimony. I think we're in the bill moving in the direction on a couple of those pieces, and probably not going to satisfy all the requests that both you and Amelia have brought up before crossover today. But I think as we think about the evolution of the medical cannabis market alongside the nascent retail market, we're going to have to continue to be in dialogue with you to make sure that we're serving patients well. I mean, I think we're trying to solve in H270 some of the immediate concerns that you brought up, but I don't think our work is going to stop there. So I want to say that for folks who are not going to be satisfied by what this bill gets across, that we're not done these conversations. So I really appreciate both you and Amelia bringing that perspective.
Oh, thank you for having us, and we appreciate your openness to have conversations again in the future.
All right. So next, we're going to be hearing from Jesse Lucas. Would you like to take the hot seat since you're here in person? Thanks for joining us today. For your patience with starting late and the snow and the craziness that hot weather brings.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair McCarthy, for inviting me down to be able to speak today, and all the fellow members of this committee for hearing us on our testimony this morning regarding H270. For the record, my name is Jesse Lucas. I am the co-owner of Boreas Ventures. I also own a small organic certified farm in Charlotte called GMG Farms. On our farm, we produce vegetables throughout the 4 seasons, along with herbs, flowers, berries, other agricultural crops and plants, which include certified organic hemp flower. I have done this for several years, and in 2002, we obtained a social equity outdoor cannabis cultivation license from the state of Vermont to grow cannabis with a higher THC than a normal hemp license would allow. This is the only one difference between hemp and cannabis that's found in the used market. This one, the percentage of this one cannabinoid in this plant that makes that one difference. Everything else is the same, the smell, the look. They grow the same, dry, cure, package, all the same way. This leads me to my dilemma as a farmer currently. I work all season to grow our cannabis flower on my farm, in the ground, with sunlight, next to all my other plants, which I can sell to the public myself, but yet I am handcuffed to sell my cannabis flower to a third party who has no obligation to even purchase what I have to offer. I would like to be able to sell our cannabis flower and products from our farm like any other farm that is able to offer their produce, meat, or other agricultural products at their location. We have this ability to do it now with everything else that we sell. Please allow us to advocate for our own cannabis flower and not be limited to a third party. Regarding the propagation license as defined in H270, which I've been invited to speak here, The market is still in its infancy and current structure is slanted towards the intermediaries. Now is the time to balance out this intermediary heavy structure by expanding allowances for producers, cultivators, and manufacturers. Now is not the time to introduce yet another license which further risks pushing the market into another intermediary dominated one. Cultivators are likely the group most interested in selling seeds and living plants. They should not be asked to spend more time and money on another license when we can simply allow them to sell their products in a safe and regulated manner, which we already do with all of our other products. And we are allowed to sell clones. We are allowed to sell seeds to other cultivators. We just can't do it to the public. So I have an issue with this. I guess, there's a gray area here for us cultivators when it comes to selling seeds and living plants. Some licenses are doing this now, some are not. Lawmakers are here to remove uncertainty from the market. In January 2022, the federal government abandoned the source rule for sourcing cannabis seeds and living plants and will instead use the THC threshold as defined in the Farm Bill. The propagation license as defined in H270 will only serve to reinforce this gray area, such that if enacted, cultivators without this propagation license will likely continue to sell seeds and living plants directly to the public, as it is occurring now. It is only important to explicitly allow licensed cultivators to sell seeds, living plants to the public, not only because it is the most healthy option for licensees in the state market, but it also to eliminate this gray area and remove the uncertainty currently being cast over us growers. We are farmers. We grow plants. Plants are agriculture. We are an agricultural state. I have a farm in an agricultural town that currently says I need a special conditional use permit to grow a plant in the ground on my farm. Let's change all these mistakes. Let's allow cannabis to be under the umbrella of agriculture. Let's embrace this new crop and work to educate the public together. I'm here today because I care about what I put into my body. I care because I have lost confidence in some of our systems that say they're looking out for my best interests. I produce organic, soil-grown agricultural crops. Can we please allow cannabis to be considered the same? I would love to hear any questions from you. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thanks for being with us.
So just within the function of the H270 with the words on the page. So you're saying right now, like with your cultivation license, the ability to sell starts essentially, which the propagation license will allow. Now, I think I have a couple of questions here. If it's actively occurring with people who currently have cultivation licenses, is that just them not understanding the structure of their license?
Sure, there could be some confusion there, yeah.
Okay, so that's like more of an education problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of education, yeah. We're still in the infancy of all of this, and there's a lot of education to take place.
Yeah.
So I agree, yeah.
Okay, and then within the issues that you're talking about at the town level, I mean, that's not something that we were necessarily addressing in here now. I'm definitely aware of it. I'm from Virgins. I'm in a budding district to you.
Sure.
So I've certainly heard about a lot of this stuff. I've worked within the conversations. This is my first year in the Committee of Jurisdiction for Cannabis Control and the market, but it is something I've been in discussion with my entire adult life. So I'm not foreign to the concept. So ultimately with that property, with that municipal conversation, I just unfortunately don't think that's something we have time to address here. We've been having conversations with other folks, so I just want to let you know that that's not something that's being glossed over.
Sure.
It's definitely an active conversation. We were discussing it just this week. So with the propagation conversation, so essentially, like, what does your vision of how you could sell to the public off of your property look like? Because I'm trying to get a firm understanding of that from people.
Sure. I mean, we sell plants already. We sell vegetables. We are currently looking at being able to build, a small farmer's market a farm stand essentially, to be able to sell all of these from. But on a municipal level, we're sort of running into sort of this backup against, we have this one plant that sort of is not defined, and it's causing a lot of confusion. And as a cultivator, to be able to sell plants to the public, I think that's in our interest and the public's interest. It's less hands touching everything. It's also coming directly from us. I guess we're giving the healthiest plants, the healthiest sort of thing to offer. And we already do that. I guess I just don't understand why we can't
But in your mind, you would only be selling the starts. You would not be selling like flour packaged, ready to go.
Oh, I would love to be able to do that
That's
also.
not what you're talking about.
No, well, I know, I mean, we're here talking about propagation licenses, but I was invited to sort of come here to speak to, because you put it all out there. Of course, I would like to be able to do that and advocate for that.
Product and whatnot. I just wanted to make sure I was honing in specifically that we were speaking to the same.
Yes, I'm trying to keep it focused.
Yes. Okay.
So what I will definitely do is when we have Brian or Chair Pepper back up is talk to them a little bit about where the board is right now with what current cultivator licenses really allow, because you've introduced for me a little bit of what I'm seeing as a need for some clarity on, can you sell seeds and starts with a current cultivator license? And it seems like some cultivator licensees are doing that, and some are saying, no, I don't think that's really allowed, and there's some uncertainty or confusion there.
I think it's a great question to ask.
Okay. Great. Any other questions for Jesse? Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. Next up, I have Maggie Lenz, who I think is here on behalf of a client who's a cultivator. Maggie, welcome to House Gov.Ops and Military Affairs. I think this might be your first time in this year.
Yep, I think so. It's nice to see everyone. I will be there in person, but I'm running late, so I'm here on Zoom. Hi, Chair McCarthy, Representative Byron. For the record, Maggie Lenz, I work with Leonine Public Affairs, and I'm here on behalf of Satori Cannabis. Satori Cannabis is a company that is located in Middlebury. They recently remediated and fitted a 116,000 square foot building. It used to be the old Connors Home building. So they have their Tier 5 cultivation license, they have their Tier 3 manufacturing license, and they have their wholesale license. And the reason I am here is because while we support the idea of a propagation license and completely agree with the witness that came right before me that it is a gray area right now and it's confusing, we would like the size of the propagation license to be increased to 3,500 minimum, or, you know, we could allow the Cannabis Control Board to set that amount at a later time. But right now, you know, the canopy is made up of the mother, which is breeding stock, and it generates no revenue. Since Vermont is filled with many small growers, Satori is projecting that they will sell starts and clones to 50 small growers, and then they're hoping to increase that to 100. And they have, you know, because of the makeup of Vermont and all the small growers, they have to keep quite a lot of variety and genetics on hand. And that is going to be about 2,500 square feet for mothers, and they're estimating about 1,000 for clones. So yeah, the nursery licenses, they generate less revenue per square foot than flower cultivators, obviously. And like I said, they need to keep a really large area of canopy that has a bunch of genetic stock in it that's in vegetative state. So the clones are cut from this mom stock, and then the canopy area of the mother does not generate revenue. So it's something that we see as an agricultural commodity, and therefore we would ask that you take the 2,500 and increase it to at least 3,500. And that's pretty much it.
Could you help me understand the sort of the reason why that? I'm just trying to understand so is it just that the idea of being able to have more, to just do more volume? Is that the logic behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it's because they're going to need so many. They're hoping to work with a lot of small growers, right? So there's going to be just so many different kinds of variety, and having 2,500, they've run the numbers. It's just not enough canopy for their purposes to create enough genetics and variety for the demand in the state.
Any other questions for Maggie? That was a pretty clear ask. We'll ask for some feedback from other folks on that. So thank you for being with us. Committee, I want to, so I believe that Eric is on Zoom, and I had scheduled a 15-minute break now, but I think it might make more sense to get Eric's testimony in the perspective of a caregiver, then take a break and come back, if that's okay with the committee going for one more. So Eric, if you're ready, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind testifying a little earlier. We're running pretty efficiently this morning.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for being with us today.
All right, thank you for having me. So my name's Eric St. Croix. I was a caregiver to a child who had cancer, and this bill on the side of medical seems to address just about every challenge we had, which was plant counts for one, and only one caregiver, only one patient. The initial issue with that was already remediated in older bills because we weren't allowed to go to the dispensary and grow, so that was a challenge. We had to get a bunch of our medicine from friends like Jesse Lynn, people like that, not Jesse in particular, but kind of a community of that. And that was already taken care of in old bills, but there were parents having custody issues at the time, and you were only allowed one extra caregiver and the primary caregiver. So two, where the parents were in a situation that they couldn't grow and both administer medicine, so they had to lose their caregiver. And this directly addresses that with the ability to add more caregivers. Also, the list of qualifications, that's a different story. That doesn't really lead into our scenario particularly, but consideration in this bill is that if a doctor is able to prescribe a medicine to somebody, shouldn't that more be the determination that not so much the qualification, but the fact that a doctor determines that either there's anxiety that needs Xanax, so cannabis could be a better alternative to that. There's a situation where the doctor thinks acute pain needs to be medicated through, say, opioids, and cannabis would be a potentially better alternative to that. So not so much basing it on qualifications, but more so whether or not a doctor is already willing to prescribe the medicine. Let's see. Plant counts was a pretty big detriment because with two plant counts, two plants for the amount you have to grow for cancer, the kind of agreed upon protocols are £1 a month. And with two plants, you're gonna maybe have a pound in about 3 to 4 months. With cancer, that could be kind of too long. So the plant counts would more allow not to have more big plants, but to not grow your plant so big and have a short grow. One of the nice parts of that is you need less intense lighting for that because you're not trying to light 4 feet deep.
Eric, I just wanted to say, it seems like every once in a while your voice is kind of fading out. I don't know if you can step a little closer to your microphone
Yes.
or your phone so we can hear you a little better.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes, that sounds very clear. Thanks.
Okay, so going from that to what's happening with the dispensaries, if we're losing dispensaries, if they're having a hard time keeping up, that's opening up more room for the need for caregivers. There's a benefit to the patient in that, in the price per pound in growing compared to purchasing. When you grow cannabis small scale, the average price to grow it is $300 a pound. That's $18.75 an ounce. At a dispensary, you're paying $300 to $400 an ounce. So on that plant count, getting your pounds quicker, getting it cheaper, there's a huge benefit in being able to do that with more plants, with not going to a dispensary. So the more of us there are to be able to do that, the more it's going to help the people who are sick to get medicine. Trying to read from a few things here. I don't think the caregiver issues right now are really have the fears that we think they could, because all of the states around us have looser regulations on their caregiver systems and even on some of their recreational grows. So to come to Vermont, which is kind of known as being a little bit of a struggle of a state, to do something devious with that, I don't really see happening. And you guys pretty much hash this out every year. So if there is some kind of, hey, we need to tighten that back up, it's not so far out that there's been a big detriment because of it. So it'd be nice to consider that on these things too. Like the people before me said, most caregivers are helping a family member, saving money, growing them a alternative, and not having a side hustle kind of business out of this thing. Let's see. I think that pretty much speaks to most of it. One person had mentioned that having a different scenario for people who move into the state. I have a friend who's from Pennsylvania and moved into the state because of our medical system, because her daughter was on the Pennsylvania medical system, was going to college, and they picked Vermont due to its ability for her to get into the medical system easy enough. Moved here just for her college, and that would have been quite a challenge if she was treated differently than somebody who was in Vermont at the time. So I think that's more the kind of people that we're seeing having to get into the system and navigate it, more so than somebody who's coming here to set up some sort of devious scam. I think for the most part, that takes care of my experience. We had a hard time because of plant counts. Having more would have allowed us to grow it quicker. And like Jesse Lynn said, if there's an issue with a plant, which we never had issues, but you have the ability to get rid of that and compensate rather than just start over. Let's see.
Eric, could I maybe ask you, most of the committee is new. We've had a lot of turnover in the House this year, and some of us have been working on cannabis policy for a couple or a few years. Some of us, this is really new. You said at the beginning that you were the caregiver for a child, and I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to kind of contextualize just a little bit of, maybe just tell us a little bit more about your story and sort of how you came to have the perspective of the inconvenience of the plant counts and that, if you don't mind, in a little bit more context for us so we can kind of understand like who is a caregiver.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've, like you say, I've done this for a few years where I add my little bit to what everybody else has said. So I forget that part. So basically because of my proximity, and I had a friend from California send straight CBD products to me a couple times for issues I had with me and my dog. So I had just after the 2014 Farm Bill kind of been fascinated by the hemp and CBD and had a friend send me some for a few things. My niece ends up at 2.5 years old with a cancer diagnosis in the middle of the night. And we start looking into cannabis and cancer. And that was kind of our first wow, just going through Google and seeing what's coming up on that. So mom decided she wanted to do that. She was down in Randolph. I was in Stowe at the time, and the only dispensary the state would allow to deal with it was Burlington CBD. And so that put me right between them. Mom's dealing with all of the hospital stuff, so she couldn't really run back and forth. So that just by chance put me as her caregiver because I said, hey, I'm willing to do whatever you need. So from there, we started getting product made from the dispensary. But as I pointed out, the price of it was pretty through the roof, and growing it was a way more viable option. But early on, you couldn't do both. So as we stopped using the dispensary, we had to find a network of people that would help us with cannabis until we got to where we had a harvest. And that took a while with 2 plants. It was not easy to get to a product for her. That process of being her caregiver and stuff was interrupted when dad and the lawyer realized that he was administering cannabis illegally to a minor. So they said there's only 2 caregiver cards allowed. Dad's got to get the second one so he can administer. And now you're back to only being able to buy from the dispensary. So that was a direct negative effect due to us not being able to have a third caregiver, which would have just been still the same one caregiver in the respect of growing it or procuring, however, medicine for her. It would have just allowed two different people at different times to administer it. So you could have that come up with in-laws who are taking care of a kid, grandparents, any scenario where a kid's with two different adults at any time who aren't the grower or medicine procurer. The few times I have gone over her story, it's nice to let everybody know that it ended well, and this May will be at 6 months with clear scans on her cancer. So she's 9.5 years old now. No noticeable cognitive decline at all. We haven't grown anything since we stopped giving her medicine. So it's not, that scenario of going out and shopping for another person I can be a caregiver for, or, hey, this is a scenario I can make some money off of. My experience and the people I've come across in this are all truthfully in that scenario where they're very happy to help somebody and get them savings and get the medicine.
Eric, thank you for expanding and sharing a little bit about your story. So glad to hear that it is going well, and hope that those scans stay clear. Anybody on the committee have questions for Eric? Really great to hear a caregiver perspective, and I really appreciate you taking the time and being with us this morning, Eric. I represent Hooper.
Well, I don't have a question. I have
I hope I don't have to see you guys next year, but if I do, it's always great to feel like I'm making a little bit of a difference in there, giving you some perspective, some real perspective to go by.
Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
I represent Hooper.
So I've been told English is not my primary language, but to clarify what both Jesselyn and, well, pretty much everybody seemed to say, my problem is not with the caregiver's interaction with the client and the business of administering cannabis. It is that through our process of giving them an authorization to operate under a particular state blessing, that we need to make sure that they are as pristine as possible. And somebody that we've had a relationship with in the state of Vermont for a long time, maybe that suffices, but somebody that comes in from out of state is a blank card for us. And I know with my elderly aunt, Eric talked about people who require a lot of care. So you become dependent, you develop a relationship. My aunt has people sign her or write out her rent checks for her just because, the Meals on Wheels guy is there a lot. She knows him. So that potential to get off that cannabis role and into something else is my flag that goes up when we talk about elderly protection. I hope that clarifies things.
So I
can't be any worse than the black and white movie thing.
So I think what I'd like to suggest, Representative Hooper, is that we go ahead and take the break I promised. We come back and pick the conversation up at 11. If you could really huddle with me and Chair Pepper and see if we can come up with a suggestion to bring back to the committee to try to alleviate your concerns, because I want to make sure that we don't leave them unaddressed, but I also think we kind of need to find a path quickly if we're going to try to make some change on that particular section. So let's take a break. We'll come back in about 15 minutes at 11 o'clock. So we'll adjourn and go off.